Latin nouns have 6 cases, 7 if you count the locative. A case is just a type of form that a noun takes that indicates its role in the sentence. In English, this would be like the relationship between the words they and them, for example, or the apostrophe s that you can add to the end of a noun phrase to indicate possession. But Latin has 6 of them, and memorizing all those unique forms spread out across 2 numbers, 3 genders, and 5 declensions is part of what makes Latin so hard to learn compared to some modern Western European languages like Spanish or French. Now, as someone who's into linguistics, I remember the first thing I did upon discovering the concept of grammatical case was to slap that keyword into the Wikipedia search bar to see which language was the most extreme. And lo and behold, Finnish is there this whole time with 15 different cases. Hungarian is worse with 18, and apparently says is in a league of its own. And so suddenly Latin's 6 or 7 wasn't looking too bad. Seems like we Latin learners actually have it relatively easy. Well, not really. Here's a chart for all the possible forms of the Latin noun lux, meaning light. And on the right, we have the Finnish word valo, with the same meaning. And that's a lot more forms. But upon further inspection, we see the critical difference. In Latin, there's no consistent pattern linking the singular forms with the plurals, while in Finnish, almost all the plurals are formed by adding an I, or its variant j between vowels, after the root, and then sticking on the same exact case suffix as a singular. Valoa becomes valoja, and valossa becomes valoissa. Beautiful and simple. And it's the same across paradigms with respect to gender and declension. In Latin, the patterns are sparse, and we're told to just memorize every possible ending. Finnish, on the other hand, completely lacks both gender and arbitrary declensions. The case and number endings are more or less consistent for every noun in the language. Many Latin adjectives have up to 42 possible case number gender combinations just for one word that we have to learn by heart. Finnish adjectives behave just like Finnish nouns. Instead of words having one suffix that conveys case, number, and gender simultaneously, they have one suffix that conveys number followed by another suffix for case. In other words, despite having twice as many cases as Latin, Finnish nominal declension is probably easier to learn simply because of its consistency. But why? For that, we'll have to get into language change and typology, aka my only reason for living. Finnish is what's called an agglutinative language. So are Hungarian and says, and probably any language that's described as having more than 8 or so cases. In agglutinative languages, affixes are glued together and compound on each other, and the boundaries between them remain intact. Contrast this to a highly fusional language like Latin, where multiple grammatical categories are fused together and marked with a single, unanalyzable affix. Of course, no natural language is perfectly one or the other. As with every classification of social phenomena, it's more of a spectrum. Finnish has processes that change the form of morphemes based on context or even unpredictable factors, and sometimes Latin words can be separated into slightly more agglutinative components. But they're pretty close to opposite sides of the spectrum, and the more transparent constitution of Finnish words is likely what allows it to have so many different possible case forms. Now, there are 2 different ways in which Latin differs from Finnish with respect to case inflection. First, the endings convey combined information about case, number, and gender, whereas Finnish keeps them separate. Second, the choice of which endings to use depends on the category of declension. There's no way to predict that the Latin word for light uses e and ibus for the ablative, singular and plural respectively, while the word for moon uses a and is, but knowing that the ablative singular of light is luce is enough to tell us that the ablative plural is lucibus, and likewise for luna and lunis respectively. They just inflect according to different categories, whereas every Finnish noun ends in sta, or sta, in the elative. It's this second property that I'll be looking at in this video, as I aim to explain the origins of and connections between the different Latin declensions. So the first question raised is, why would a language have declensions at all if it makes the morphology less transparent and predictable? And essentially, the answer is sound change. We can look at Finnish one last time for an example of how declensions might arise. Here are a few forms of the Finnish word for light and name. Valo, as we've seen, has a consistent stem onto which the case suffixes are added. Nimi is a little more complicated. Whereas the nominative singular ends in an I, the other forms have an E, and the genitive plural has been obscured somewhat. But it's not super hard to guess what happened here. We can assume that the stem once was, or perhaps underlyingly is, an invariant nime, which inflected exactly like valo. With that, we posit a couple sound changes, namely that an E becomes I at the end of a word, and that the diphthong A shifts to simply E. You can think of these sound laws either as synchronic rules that speakers productively apply to generate words, or as diachronic shifts that occurred at some point in the past, leading to a slightly irregular paradigm. Really, both of these analyses are correct. Sound changes must have occurred to give rise to this pattern, but the overall inflection is still intact enough that modern speakers can intuitively understand nimi-yen to be fundamentally no different than valo-yen. But the point is that this is sort of a proto-declension. There's nothing about the meanings of the words valo and nimi that causes them to inflect differently. Rather, it's the historical forms of these words that have set them on slightly different paths. You can imagine how a bunch of sound changes layered on top of one another may cause the overall patterns to lose transparency. At that point, speakers may just take it as a fact that nimi and valo work differently, just because they do. And if that happens, then you'd have a system just like Latin's declensions. So this raises the question, was Latin once an agglutinative language that drifted toward fusional over time? And the answer is yeah, kinda. Languages don't pop out of thin air fully formed with a set of complex declensions designed specifically to give me nightmares. No, it all must have come from somewhere, and it's reasonable to assume that most fusional morphology has arisen from previous agglutinative affixes jumbled together as a result of sound change and some other factors. Theoretically, we may be able to work backwards and figure out some of the processes that led to the mess that is Latin, and doing that can give us a better understanding of Latin, both its specifics and the language as a whole, which helps disentangle the grammar and hopefully makes it a bit easier to remember. Anyway, here are the basic forms for each declension. The numbers for the declensions are basically arbitrary, but the categories themselves aren't, and the main distinguishing factor is that each declension has a certain vowel that's prevalent throughout the endings. Remember that in Finnish, it was the fact that the stem vowel of nimi, originally a short e, triggered certain sound changes that caused it to differ from valo. I want to show how the exact same thing happened in Latin. The old stem final vowels, we can call them theme vowels if we really want to, merged differently with the originally ubiquitous case endings to produce the present variation. Notice how every fifth declension ending has an e in it, and first and fourth have almost all a's and u's respectively. The theme vowel is less obvious for the second and third declensions though. For the third we can put down both e and I for now, and that covers most of it. But the second will require some more thought. And there are 3 lines of attack that we can take to gather more information and make some sense out of this. The first is what historical linguists call internal reconstruction, and what I call just thinking about it. Under the assumption that the theme vowel is the determining factor for a noun's declension, and it was phonological fusion of the true case/number markers with this theme vowel that created the declensions, just like in the Finnish example, might we hypothesize that, as in the fifth declension, ignoring vowel length for now, the characteristic vowel once appeared in all the suffixes? Based on this assumption, might we further hypothesize that the short u we observe in the nominative and accusative singular was actually once an o? We can see such an interplay between short o and short u in the endings of certain pronouns. The neuter version of qui is quod, while the neuter of ille is illud. Od and ud, clearly similar suffixes with the same function, one with an o and one with a u. To frame it as a regular sound law, perhaps short o became short u in final closed syllables of polysyllabic words, or something. That would certainly make the second declension make more sense. And likewise, we have all these long i's. Might we hypothesize that these i's descended from oi diphthongs? Such a sound change known as diphthong smoothing is really common cross-linguistically. It also makes a ton of sense if we compare the first declension, where the nominative plural and genitive singular are both a diphthong I, starting with the theme vowel a, and the dative/ablative plural suffix could follow the same pattern, originally ois for o stems and eis for I stems, but both diphthongs were smoothed to long I, pronounced e, leaving the endings homophonous. That kind of bridge between the declensions is precisely the goal of this whole thing, because now, not only are the theme vowels ubiquitous throughout the paradigms, but most of the endings between the first and second declensions are identical, the suffixes differing only in the theme vowel, which was once part of the stem. And we haven't even looked at the real evidence yet, because all that internal reconstruction is very satisfying, but it's also quite circular in its reasoning at times. To draw solid conclusions, we need to move on to the second line of attack, which is historical data. Classical Latin is a literary construct that developed during the late Roman Republic. It was based on a spoken language that, like all spoken languages, had centuries of its own history, replete with phonological and grammatical change. Pre-classical varieties of Latin are often called Old Latin, which includes the plays of Plautus and extends all the way back to some of the earliest written records in Italy. There's a ton of inscriptional attestation of Old Latin, illustrating some of the changes it went through. And looking at some Old Latin examples, our hypotheses are more or less confirmed. The nominative us shows up as os on some old rocks and stuff, and those long i's appear very frequently written as ei digraphs on similarly old rocks for both the second and first declensions. Now, ei isn't the same as oi and I, but it demonstrates at least that those long vowels were once diphthongs. Which brings us one step closer to validating the guesses that we made. And by we, I mean I, and by guesses, I mean the stuff I read in a book and am pretending to rediscover for a YouTube video. And there is, in fact, one inscription on a ridiculously old bronze something or other that shows the original oi diphthong of the dative/ablative plural, which is powerful evidence of the sound's form equality when combined with the patterns observed so far, probably, maybe. But wait, hold your horses, me. I'm ignoring a big problem. See, historical linguistic evidence is like the fossil record. When paleontologists find bones in older strata than their supposed ancestors, it means they have to work on their theory. Likewise, there's some inconsistency with those diphthongs that complicates this picture. In Old Latin inscriptions all over the place, we get stuff like this for the phrase populi Romani, a noun-adjective pair in the genitive singular. It's the exact same suffix in both words. Surely it was pronounced the same. So why on earth is it spelled differently in adjacent words and inconsistently across documents, or even within the same document? There's only one real answer. The people who inscribed those documents must have just been using EI as a spelling convention for the same sound as the I, despite pronouncing them identically. The reason for this, as with most all goofy spelling conventions, is that there used to be a diphthong A that shifted to E, only the writing stuck sometimes, and eventually the digraph was reinterpreted as just another way to spell long I. And if we go further back in time, we do end up with a clear distinction. The nominative, dative, and ablative plural endings are consistently spelled with the letters EI. But, alas, the genitive singular was without exception in this early period written with a lonely I. Disaster. What can we make of this? Well, it means that the O-stem genitive singular was never a diphthong, at least not in any period we have access to. At the time of the earliest Latin writing, the sound that became the long I of the nominative, dative, and ablative plural suffixes was still pronounced and written as a diphthong, but the genitive singular suffix was a simple monophthong. We therefore can't posit a previous form of the suffix containing the theme vowel. To potentially help, we can turn to the third and most awesome angle of investigation, comparative analysis. The Greeks were declining nouns while Romulus and Remus were still suckling at the teat of their lupine mom. Here are the suffixes for the ancient Greek second declension, much more easily identifiable as the O stems. It's immediately obvious that these languages are somehow related, and as we would expect from two dialects taking diverging paths of evolution, the old Latin forms resemble the Greek ones even more closely than the classical ones. And notice the dative singular. Every dative singular suffix in Latin ends with a long I, except the first declension, which has a conspicuously I-shaped diphthong, and the second, which is the odd one out. But the Greek ending here does end with an I, which was still pronounced at some point. Is it a reasonable guess that Latin had it too? Well, yes, because there actually are inscriptions with that ending that I didn't put up earlier. Okay, moving on. Yeah, Greek doesn't actually resolve the issue of the genitive singular. That's still sticking out like a sore thumb. So we're just going to ignore this one and hope it doesn't matter. There are actually two other endings that don't contain a short O no matter how far back you go, those being the neuter nominative/accusative/vocative plural and the non-neuter vocative singular. For the purposes of this video, they're also just unanalyzable. But for reasons I hope to explore in future videos, they're really not problematic at all. The genitive singular in particular is simply a menace. And I didn't put this in the script, but now that I think about it, you could just see the vocative singular as a weakened form of the theme vowel on itself with no ending, as happens to originally short vowels at the complete ends of words, weakened to a short E. So that's even less of a problem. Anyway, first declension. The A stems. It's been mostly elucidated already, but I want to make clear the fact that the diphthongs spelled AE in classical Latin go back to an older AI, pronounced I, and they're attested as such in Old Latin. The genitive singular in particular often scans disyllabically in Old Latin meter, implying that both A and I were long at that point. This makes sense if the ending is the same as the weird one in the second declension, only tacked on to the theme vowel instead of replacing it for whatever reason. Next, the fourth declension isn't much of a problem. The only anomaly is the dative/ablative plural, which has ibus, where we might expect an ubus. But in fact, there are some short fourth declension nouns that tend to use ubus. Otherwise, the short I is attributable to the kind of vowel weakening that happens all over the place in Latin. We see this kind of alternation with a lot of vowels in different phonetic situations, and some examples of it happening with U specifically are in the compound cornifer, where the U in cornu weakens to an I, and in the oblique cases of the noun caput, capitis. It's not hard to imagine this also taking place in the fourth declension suffixes, which had basically the same phonetic conditions. So now it's time for the final boss, the third declension, which is a big mess. It's the only declension where a case form apparently has no suffix at all, but one realization makes it a lot more manageable. As all my fellow Latin learners know, much to our chagrin, they lied to us, and the third declension is actually two declensions in a trench coat, the I stems and the non-I stems. I stems have a genitive plural in ium, and sometimes an ablative singular with a long I. A few have im for the accusative singular, and especially in earlier or archaizing writing, an occasional accusative plural is. So what we're really seeing is the remnants of an entirely separate declension that's being slowly absorbed. And so what's the original declension that the I stems are being merged with? Well, notice how there are a lot of different ways a third declension noun can end in the nominative singular, but the vast majority of non-neuter nouns end in an S, that or an X, which is really just a writing convention for KS clusters. Most of the stem variation between the nominative singular and the other forms of the noun can be accounted for with just a few simple sound change laws. For example, the noun tempus temporis is perfectly regular if we assume an original tempos, which underwent the change from short O to short U in final syllables that we already saw in the second declension, as well as a change from S to R between vowels that would affect the other forms. The latter change would account for masculine nouns ending in or as well. Honor honores was still written honos by Cicero, before that R in the stem was extended into the nominative by analogy. That is, the R was reinterpreted as part of the stem, and so people started using it even for the nominative where it shouldn't really be. All this to say that there actually was a mostly consistent nominative singular suffix for the third declension, only it didn't contain a theme vowel, being a simple S, except in the I stems. Most of those retain their theme vowel, ending in is, though there has been some obscuring due to sound change. What's important is that the core of the third declension is athematic. It comes from nouns whose stem at one point didn't end in a vowel at all. We can call them consonant stems, and this would include a noun like tempus, which, though it superficially looks like its second declension, the root itself ends in a consonant, and thus the stem ends in a consonant, that being the S, or R. If we separate out the purely I stem suffixes, those presumably original to the I stem declension, we can see that all of them contain the thematic I, except for the nominative plural and certain nominative singulars. The suffixes left over must all either be the original consonant stem suffixes, or in cases where they overlap, original I stem suffixes that have been generalized to the whole third declension. Exactly which is beyond the scope of this video. So at this point, we can consider the theme vowel sufficiently figured out for our purposes. There are still a few failures in the second declension, and I've left the third declension somewhat ambiguous, but it's enough to start looking at the true endings. And note the distinction I'm making between suffix and ending. The suffix contains both the theme vowel, or lack thereof, and the case ending, and is attached to the root, which is the lexical core of the word. The root plus the theme vowel is called the stem, hence the term O stem, U stem, etc. for stems ending in the theme vowels O and U. This distinction isn't very important in Latin from a synchronic standpoint, but in comparative and historical analysis, it's vital. What we've done so far is extract the theme vowel from the suffix, exposing the original endings. And so all that's left is to note the patterns and discrepancies among these endings. Starting with the nominative singular, there are really three possible endings, sm and nothing. M occurs in the neuter O stems. The null ending is found in the A stems, U stem neuters, and pretty unpredictably in the third declension, though there it's also mostly neuters. Some I stem neuters just have a short E, which is a weakened version of the bare theme vowel, and the generic nominative singular ending is S. As for nouns like ager and puer and wir, those are just O stems that have lost their ending to a regular sound change. It's just an annoying minor exception. Luckily, though, the nominative singular is easily the most convoluted category, which kind of makes sense given it was the most basic form of the noun. It's some really ancient morphology. I should also mention that the third declension includes some nouns that are truly heteroclitic, meaning that they use one stem for the nominative singular, and accusative if neuter, and another for all other forms. As previously stated, the vast majority of variation in the third declension comes down to just a few regular sound laws, but for nouns like homo and iter and iecur, no Latin sound rules explain the alternation. It just has to be memorized. Moving on, the genitive singular is simpler but still annoying. The third and fourth declensions share an ending s, with all other nouns using a long I. The oddity is that the long I ending actually replaces the theme vowel for O stems. It seems that whatever tortuous process led to the origin of that suffix, it happened in the O stems first, and that ending was subsequently brought over to the A stems, which seemed to be conceptually adjacent to the O stems, providing the default feminine construction to the O stems masculine and neuter. It also got ported to the fifth declension because why not? That declension isn't real anyway. I've put the word lengthen in parentheses when the ending seems to trigger a long theme vowel whenever one is present. This has no effect for the long I ending, since classical Latin doesn't allow multiple long vowels next to each other, but it'll come into play shortly. Of course, this analysis is imperfect, as it doesn't explain why the theme vowel is short in the third declension but long in the fourth, but so far as I can tell, that's the only big exception. You could think of the I stem suffix as copied from the consonant stem one, which features essentially a prop vowel, originally a short E but weakened to a short I, if that makes any sense. Bear with me, it gets better. The dative singular finally presents some consistency. It was originally straightforwardly a long I ending, with the sole exception of U stem neuters, which have kind of given up on inflecting in the singular. The accusative singular was always just M, except for neuter nouns whose nominative wasn't also M. The rule that the nominative and accusative are identical for neuters has always held true throughout history. The ablative singular is a long form of the theme vowel except for consonant stems, where it's just short E. The A and O stems had an original nominative plural ending of short I. Again, we see those two declensions following the same pattern, with the rest taking an ending S. As for neuters, the ending is always a short A, which follows the stem vowel in I and U stems, but replaces it in O stems. Why? Ferdinand de Saussure. The genitive plural always ends in but the A and O stems have a random R in between, and the fifth declension tags along because it's not real. The dative and ablative plural are identical and always have been. Again, the A and O stems go together with an original is ending, while the others have bus. Finally, the accusative plural, my beloved. It invariably takes the lengthened theme vowel plus S, except for neuters, in which case it's the same as a nominative. Now, it's no coincidence that the A and O stems, sometimes alongside the E stems, use a different marker than the others. Notice how, in many cases, the A and O stem ending resembles that of many pronouns, which inflect a little differently than the nouns proper. It's reasonable to hypothesize that the A and O stem nouns started using endings that were original to the pronouns for various reasons. This is an example of morphological analogy, which is the other way, alongside sound change, that morphology can become more fusional. Supporting the assumption that these anomalous endings are originally pronominal is that there are some forms in idioms and archaizing poetry using the more general endings, like paterfamilias with an archaic genitive, familias using the S, the long theme vowel, and sestertium, which idiomatically means 100,000 sestertius coins alongside measure words. And that's everything. Even after all this, Latin is still nowhere near finished in its categorical transparency. There's still weird variation based on gender and arbitrary differences between declensions that have cropped up over time. And there's still no separation between markers for case versus number. Perhaps they exist, but we'll have to dig a lot deeper to find them. And there's plenty more I didn't talk about, but hopefully this was a useful overview and you learned something. Maybe it'll help paradigms stick in your head a little better, if nothing else. Knowing this crap has certainly helped me memorize it all.